Hello, everyone, and welcome to this relatively spontaneous little ramble I decided to do. Um, I don't know that this is anything I'll do on a regular basis, but as an experiment. For those of you who are veteran viewers of either the Lords of the Night stream or pretty much any other show that I've been on, I have mentioned from time to time that I do have as the title suggests, morbid fascination with things like serial killers and individuals such as that. So I don't think it should come as much surprise that something like the Chris Watts case might gain my attention. But unlike a lot of other similar stories where you have a parent who kills their children or a husband who kills their wife, there are a lot of elements to this particular story that make it really fascinating to me. It's sort of the combination of things. You take any one of these elements by themselves, and as cynical a thing as it is to say, it's nothing new. But put all together, I don't know. I just can't seem to get past just how interesting this entire case is. Before I get into that, hello, FC260, the gayest person on YouTube. Hello, Disturbing Zen. Hello, Night of Charlemagne. Hello, hello, Grizzly. So for those of you who are not aware of this case, which could possibly be so, I don't know. Back in August of this year, between the 12th and the 13th, a resident of Frederick, Colorado, named Chris Watts or Christopher Watts, killed his two young children, Bella 4 and Celeste 3, as well as his wife, Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant at the time with their unborn son, Nico. Purportedly, it's difficult to tell for sure because of the way the bodies were disposed of and Chris Watts' story and the lack of some physical evidence. But presumably, he strangled all three of them to death, loaded their bodies into his truck, drove off to a work site that he had been working at. He dropped the children's bodies into two separate oil tanks and then buried his pregnant wife and, along with his unborn son in a shallow grave just off of that piece of property. He then played dumb for the next 24 hours, 48 hours or so as to where his wife could have gone. And he even did an interview with local news saying that he didn't know where they were and he wanted them back, etc. But within about 24 hours of that, he had confessed to, at least at that time, murdering his wife, whom he claimed had been in the process of killing his children. And he killed her in rage or something over her killing their children. That's the general sort of high-level description of what happened. But in addition to that, there are a lot of things about this case that just boggle me. Just absolutely boggle me. And so I thought, just for the hell of it, just because it's been on my mind the last couple of days, I thought I would ramble off those things to you. And if you have anything to add, chat, by all means. I will be keeping attention to the chat as we go, off and on. Who else is here now? Celtic Mandalore, hello. Death Hayukin, hello. Blind Rambler, hello. Broral13, hello. Alan Sawyer, hello. Seftis Wolf, hello. Army Awake 44, hello. Tartanist, hello. So, why is this case, of all the other sort of atrocities we might hear about on a daily basis these days, standing out to me? Well, it's kind of the incongruity of some of the elements of the case, but probably more than anything else, it's the extensive documentation of the case on video and recording, audio recording. Unlike most other murders that I can think of, or cases of murder or murder mysteries, this case was on film almost from the moment the investigation began. Now, in a lot of these situations, you hear about this stuff after the fact. Usually, maybe after the bodies are found, then they go back and try to reconstruct, like, well, what were the people doing at the time, or who said what, and everything else. This is unique, as far as I know. I mean, there may be other cases like it, but as atrocious a crime as this was, I think it's unique that the moment the first call came in that something was wrong, that Shannon, I'm going to say Shannon, even though it's Shannon, I'm going to say Shannon, that's just a reflexive thing, that Shannon Watts went missing. The moment that she was reported missing, we had footage. We had body cam footage from the cops. So what had happened was Shanann had been on a trip, I believe to North Carolina, pretty sure. She came home at about 2 a.m., dropped off by her friend Nicole. The next day, Shannon had a OBGYN appointment that she had to go to because she was 15 weeks pregnant. When her friend Nicole did not hear from her in regards to this or anything else, she got very worried and she called the cops. And the cops show up for a wellness check on a 15-week pregnant woman. And from that moment, we see the action in real time through body cam footage released by the authorities. So it's amazing, really, because the cops are at the guy's house, at Chris Watts' house, with her friend, Nicole, before Chris Watts arrives. Now, so far as I can tell from the timeline of things, when Chris Watts gets to the house on the footage, he has just finished dumping his family's bodies. He got back to the house. Again, this is as far as I understand it. He was getting back to the house after dumping the bodies and having sort of finalized the crime. And he had not expected the cops to be there. Now, how can you presume this? Well, we go along in the footage with the cops, with Nicole, with Chris Watts, as they tour the house, and they find items of Shannon's, personal stuff, her phone, her purse, all this other stuff that presumably even the most sort of dumb murderer probably would have gotten rid of before the cops arrive to underscore the story that she left of her own accord. But Chris Watts, being an idiot, and I'm not going to complain about him being an idiot because he was caught so easily, didn't think to take those things with him when he went to dump the bodies. It also doesn't help that he left his wife's car behind because since he was doing this solo, he couldn't both carry the bodies off with the truck and also get rid of the wife's car at the same time. He might have attempted to do that later, but he would have been caught. We'll talk about that shortly. So yeah, and then you got the body camera footage of the cops at the initial reporting of the crime. You've got the news interview with Chris Watts, I believe just the next day, because it was like the 14th into the 15th where he finally got talked to by the police. And then you have the interrogation footage, both his lie detector test and the questioning that took place afterwards at the police station the same day he gave that interview. And so almost from beginning to arrest of the investigation is filmed. You can watch this. I mean, some of it's boring, not much goes on. Cops kind of wandering around the house looking around, but I'm waiting for the supercut of all the footage in chronological order put together where you can go all the way through this thing from the point at which she was discovered missing. So that makes it a very interesting case to begin with, because you get to see the suspect before he was known to be a suspect, how he behaves, what he says, his demeanor, his body language, kind of the aura he gives off as everybody's looking into this. It's amazing to watch. And there's one particular clip. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but let's go back to the chat real quick. Let's see. What do people have to say? Army Awake says Chris Watts didn't think Nicole would get there so quick. Yeah, I don't think he had any notion that anyone would have missed Shannon that quickly, and so he was completely taken aback. And you can kind of see that as things proceed in that first set of videos. Burl 13 says, thank goodness for a friend Nicole. Yeah, thank goodness for Nicole. Thank goodness for his next door neighbor with the motion activated security camera. That's the particular piece of footage that I want to promote. You can find it out there. There's one particularly good one that's just called like Chris Watts shitting his pants. I'll get to that in a second. Three-sided coin said, what did the lie detector test show? I'm always fascinated by those, Scribe Light. Well, if you watch the footage, the lie detector test was honestly incidental. I have no doubt that the lie detector test showed he was being deceptive because the guy had absolutely no self-control. But it was the way the female investigator, for lack of a better phrase, buttered him up prior to the lie detector. She tries to prep him. She's very friendly. She's very sort of laid back and accommodating. She's like, okay, so, we just have to do this to eliminate you from the process. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. So just to set your mind at ease, because, people being nervous and stuff, that can throw off the test a little bit. So if I asked you something like, when was the last time you saw your wife? You would say what? She's almost interrogating him through casual prep before you even get to the lie detector test. And then, of course, after the lie detector test and the results are obviously negative in his favor, kaboom, he's pretty much done. Anyway, I'll cover some of that later. I want to talk about the elements of this case that make it in combination so interesting to me. First and foremost, as doesn't really need to be said, I suppose, but it is significant, Chris Watts committed, in combination, some of the most heinous crimes a human being can commit on another human being. Okay? On the list of horrible things you can do in regards to other people, he hit several check marks at the top of the list. First and foremost, he killed a child. Okay? Well, I mean, he killed 2 children, but, how many do you need to kill to be a monster? He killed 2 small, innocent children. All right, setting aside his relationship to those children, anyone who is a child killer is pretty much the worst of the worst to begin with. But he did it twice. Technically 3 times. We'll get to that. So setting that aside, let's say he hadn't done that. Let's say he hadn't killed children. Okay? He kills a pregnant woman. All right? I mean, you want to talk about a crime against absolute and total innocence, a 15-week-along pregnant woman, wherein the unborn child is obviously completely helpless and defenseless and innocent. And by extension, a pregnant woman isn't necessarily entirely incapable of defending herself, but insofar as any civilized person knows, a heavily pregnant woman is in a vulnerable state by default. And and again, I'm not trying to diminish the notion of just killing somebody who's not pregnant or whatever, but I'm just talking about sort of on the gradients of atrocity. This is up there. Killing a pregnant woman is pretty low, if not one of the lowest things you can do. But Chris Watts did both. He both killed children and a pregnant woman. Okay. Now, then you have to consider his relationship to all 4 of these people. And I am going to include the unborn child because at that point, yeah, he had a name. It was a kid. His family. Now, family elimination as a crime unto itself, setting aside the age of the participants, let's say, is also one of the most ridiculously horrific things you can think of. Really. When I first heard about this case, the first comparison that came to my mind was John List. Now, if you don't know who John List was, well, he was a guy who killed his family, obviously. This happened back in the, I want to say, early 70s to mid 70s. He was on the East Coast, and I don't remember all the details, guys. This is just from memory. So if I'm a little off here and there, I apologize for those of you that might know better. He was on the East Coast, and he killed, I believe it was his 2 or 3 children and his wife. But this wasn't a sort of crime of passion or spontaneous moment kind of thing for this guy. John List shot his wife in the back of the head, waited until one kid got home from school or their job or something. I believe they were teenagers or young teens. Shot the kid in the back of the head. Then he went to school to pick up his other kid, brought his kid home, and then after getting out and getting into the house with the kid, shot that kid in the back of the head. And he piled up the bodies somewhere, and then he packed up everything, locked up the house, well, turned on the lights first, then locked up the house and left. And he disappeared for like 30 years. And the fact that his family and he are very reclusive, no one thought to check on them for almost a month. So this guy had a month head start to disappear, change his identity, get a whole new family built up over time. And he wasn't caught until the late 80s or early 90s or something. And only because America's Most Wanted put out footage of a age progression sculpture somebody had did. There were very few photos of John List because I think he burned or cut up all the photos of himself in the household before he left, which back then, I mean, if you want to hide your identity, that's one way to do it. But surviving photos of him were used to age progress and make a sculpture of his face that was so accurate to how he had aged that somebody recognized him and finally turned him in. Anyway, that's a long, convoluted sidetrack, but family extermination is an abhorrent crime all by itself, no matter what the age of the family. Like if you killed your adult children and your elderly mother and father, it doesn't matter if they were young, older, just killing your family it doesn't grok in my head, and nor does it in most people's minds. So Chris Watts kills children, pregnant wife, eliminates his entire family. Okay, that's in and of itself, that crime is just, beyond imagining for most people, beyond belief. But now you look at the perpetrator, and that's what makes this even more bizarre. And before I get to that, I'll go back to the chat. Sar Jim says, lie detector results aren't admissible, so they still need to be billed the case with other evidence. True, but in conversational and interrogation terms, the results or the purported results can be used as leverage on a suspect. And in this case, Chris Watts just got cornered. He didn't want to look guilty by calling for a lawyer, so he just kept going, and eventually he had nowhere else to go. Let's see. Oh, well, okay, Sar Jim talks about the mistress. We'll talk about the mistress. I'll get to motive here in a minute. The mistress is a whole other story that's interesting. Faithless says, but what if they are really annoying? Oh, Faithless. I don't know what to say to that. I don't know what to say. Irish Rose said he also killed his mom. John List? Did he? Maybe he did. I can't remember now. I know Chris Watts didn't kill his own mother, but or at least not directly. She might be having a heart attack now. Let's see. Army Awake says, Chris was just going to go on with his life like nothing happened, no regret at all. That seemed to be the intention until he got back from dropping off the bodies. We'll get to his execution, no pun intended, of the crime shortly. So the other thing that makes this a completely oddball circumstance is the perpetrator. Chris Watts, so far as everyone knew, and so far as the record shows, to the best of my knowledge, had no history of violence. He wasn't some kind of convicted criminal of anything in the past. He hadn't done anything untoward to anyone before. So far as I know, there was no record of domestic violence with Chris Watts. Everyone who knew him talked about how laid back he was, how soft-spoken he was, how friendly, how helpful. And I know the old line is, oh, it's always the quiet ones, or, the serial killer is always the last person you'd expect. Well, yeah, sure, but this guy wasn't some serial killer. He wasn't some, dyed-in-the-wool practiced psychopath. He may indeed be a psychopath, but he hadn't shown anything that we know of to this point of having those tendencies. We might find out later that maybe he was, torturing animals when he was a kid or something. But so far as I know, nothing indicated to anybody ahead of time that he'd be somebody capable of this kind of thing. He was your stereotypical suburban sort of dad, soccer dad. You know, he's the kind of guy you'd expect to be teaching the local softball team or something. You know, not a mass killer, for lack of a better word. You know, you get from 3 or more people. So that is also fascinating to me because one of the things that always gets me about serial killers is trying to, sort of comprehend the incomprehensible, but sort of wonder, where is the line between impulse and action with something as horrific as taking another person's life? You know, because most of us have evil thoughts from time to time in life. Very few of us actually act on them. And it's the crossing of from one side to the other that, insofar as we talk about philosophically, is where evil begins, actually enacting your impulses to harm others. And so the fact that this guy had nothing that seemed to indicate he was capable of such things or had such things, within his grasp to just, switch over and do something this awful, it's just fascinating to me, and I will probably never know why exactly, because, you can't trust the guy. But that part just is sort of like this wasn't some, a guy with a long criminal record or some long history of having beat his wife or something or whatever. The most that I know of is that he and his wife declared bankruptcy about 3 years ago or thereabouts. But that's not a crime in and of itself, except maybe of irresponsibility. Let's see. Army Awake. He snapped. He wanted a new life. Yeah. Well, like I say, we'll get to the motive here in a minute. So yeah. Well, let's get to that now. What caused Chris Watts to do something like this? Well, in the course of things, Chris Watts met somebody at work, and he had an affair with this lady at work, Nicole McKesson, I think her last name is. And she was a health nut. She had a kind of nice body, I guess. She's a hot little number, I suppose you could call her. Now, from everything we can tell, basically Chris Watts felt stifled by his wife. She was controlling. She was sort of keeping up with the Joneses. I think the implication was, or maybe there's evidence to it, that their bankruptcy was a direct result of her overspending or sort of trying to do a fake it till you make it sort of prosperity kind of thing. She worked for some, I think it was like some kind of mail order or leveled marketing company while he was working for a gas company, Anadarko. And so the theory is that between fatherhood and his controlling wife and everything else, Chris felt trapped. And this led him to have this affair with his coworker, whom, by her testimony, did not tell her about the situation with his wife, except that he was going to be getting separated from her, and that was in process. And so the notion is that he had this affair. He saw that he wanted to be free of his obligations and everything else from his wife, but doing an actual divorce would have far more, complications to it socially and financially, I suppose, or maybe just to his ego or his standing in the community or something. There's no real rationalizing why you would go towards murder rather than divorce, but in the insanity of such a person, I suppose that might be the case. So he decided, apparently, that his only way out of the whole situation, to be free, to sleep with his mistress and have a completely new life, clean slate, was to murder his whole family. Which is, okay, crazy, obviously. Now, the role of the mistress in this whole thing is a little bit murky. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that he did this out of a financial motive. If there was going to be some kind, because his story was she just left and disappeared. If he was going for life insurance or anything else, then there would have to have been something staged or something otherwise. His stupid plan was that she just disappeared off the face of the earth with the kids and never came home, because that makes all the sense in the world. And of course, nobody would spend any time looking for her or anything. Yeah. So if he had thought that there was going to be some kind of financial benefit from having done this, that didn't seem to be the main motivation. It seemed to be the mistress, or at least the idea of not being married and a father anymore. Now, the mistress, her story, and again, her entire testimony, or at least her interview testimony, is on tape. She gave 2 major interviews to the police around the time. She fascinates me just because of her sort of emotional detachment from everything that's going on around her, and her weird rationalizations of why she got involved with him in the first place. She said that he didn't wear a wedding ring when he met her, or she met him, and they first started hanging out. She didn't balk, it seems, when he did reveal that he was married and that he had kids and that he wasn't actually divorced yet. She still carried on this affair. She went with him to their house on at least 2 occasions while the wife was on business trips or something. And during the entirety of the interviews with her, there doesn't seem, if you knew that someone you had been associated with romantically in an intense and fiery, passionate affair for several weeks to that point, just murdered their entire family and killed their children, possibly on behalf of you, you'd think there'd be a bit more shock or concern or emotional outburst about that entire thing. Not this lady. She is just so conversational, so casual, so more concerned about other things, sitting there tapping away at her phone during the interview that you can see it on film. I guess the 2 were just a match made in heaven, because you've got 2 individuals who are very, very, very conscious about their self-image, they're body conscious and health conscious, and they're very, very concerned about just themselves. Selfish, self-centered people. Now, the big question is, did she have any role, directly or indirectly, in the murders? There doesn't seem to be any evidence that anyone but Chris Watts actually committed the crimes and disposed of the bodies. Did she have any communication with him that said, you need to take care of your wife if we're going to be together, or anything like that? There isn't, primarily because she deleted a good portion, if not all, of the communications between her and Chris Watts before the police got involved in things. And if you watch the footage of Chris Watts after he's arrived at home and the police are there on the body cams, you can see him tapping away and checking his phone constantly throughout the course of his being in the presence of the police. You got to wonder who he was talking to at that point. I suppose it could have been family or friends concerned about Shannon and everything, but it was so early on, I don't know that anybody else but the most immediate people there in the neighborhood would have had an idea. So you got to wonder, was he talking to the mistress? What were they talking to each other about? Is there any record that can be found of what the communications were before, during, and after the crime? I don't know. It appears, so far as I can tell, that she deleted everything, and they don't have a record of that. Even though they got access to her phone, I don't know if anything was recovered. Going back to the chat, Angela Ariaga says, "Hi, Scribelight. So glad you're live. Great mood boost for the workday." Well, I'm glad I can boost your mood. What else we got? Burl13 says, "Oh, that's shady as heck." Yeah, her deleting her information when she knew what was. She had a notion. If you listen to the interviews with her, she had an idea that the wife had disappeared. She's getting word of this, and then she decided to delete everything. Her explanation is she wanted to cut herself off from him completely at that point. Now, I suppose, dropping somebody from your friends list on Facebook might be a natural reaction to something like that. Deleting conversations you had with him that may be relevant to an ongoing murder investigation? Now, one of the things, but along with that, one of the things that she showed the most concern about in her first interview, when her dad was with her at this interview for some odd reason, I guess in place of a lawyer, I guess, her main concern was some of the texts and or images getting out that had passed between her and Chris because of their raunchy nature. Again, she was more concerned about how she came out looking in this whole situation than helping the cops and figuring out what happened to the missing wife and kids. Because I think around the time of that first interview, they still hadn't found Shannon and the kids at that point. I don't think they had gotten Chris to confess. But yeah, so you had two people who were completely just callous to anyone but their own needs, wants, and desires. And Chris Watts was the only one who had a family that was an anchor to him being free. So he decided to murder his family. So what's the other part of this that fascinates me? So first we have just the enormity of the crimes committed. We have the unlikeliness or unlikelihood or whatever of the perpetrator in context with the crimes. But then you have the absolute stupidity of the crime. And this is where I'm going to get a little more into the morbid sense of things because, you know, if you're going to kill somebody, you should have a plan. And Chris Watts's plan, which he had time to try to figure out, was so stupid, was so ill-conceived as to how he was going to explain the disappearance of his wife and children. I can only chalk it up to absolute nutballness, you know, because everything was very, like I said, this wasn't a crime of passion in the sense that, you know, he just snapped and just there was a bloodbath and everything else. You know, he strangled his kids and his wife, and manual strangulation or suffocation. It's not a quick thing. This is a long process. It's not an immediate gratification thing like a stab to the throat or a shot from a gun. It's not, you know, regardless of what some of the movies say, and movies are doing it a little bit more accurately in the last several years. But manual strangulation to kill someone is not an easy or quick process. It is very personal, it's very physical, and it takes a long time, a lot longer than some, like I say, TV shows or movies might have you believe. So at every second that he had his hands around his wife and his kids' throats, he was making a decision. He was making a conscious decision to take their lives. You know, it wasn't a, you know, reflex reaction with a knife in your hand and oops, I stabbed you in the heart or something. No, at every moment, it was a premeditation to kill these people. So then he does that. Now here's the other part, the part that's most entertaining. If you look at the footage, and again, you look at like Chris Watts, there's several different video copies of it out there. There's one called, you know, Chris Watts shitting his pants. There's Chris Watts realizes he's been caught. His next door neighbor had a porch camera, a security camera. Apparently there had been some package thefts off of porches in the neighborhood. And so this neighbor had set up a motion detecting porch camera that looked just off in the corner right at Chris Watts's driveway. And every time there was any motion, any cars coming down the street, anybody walking around out there, the camera would flip on, record for 30 seconds, unless or until the movement stopped, and then go on its way. Well, he recorded not only the wife arriving at 2 a.m. when the friend dropped her off, but then Chris Watts backing up the truck into the garage of his house. Chris Watts then walking around the truck and doing who knows what. It's hard to tell. And then Chris Watts driving away, purportedly, and, well, there's really no doubt, with his wife and children in the back of the truck as he drove off to the site to dump them off, before he would eventually come back home and find the cops already there. So what was his plan? What was he thinking of doing? Because the wife's car is still there. So he has a truck that's a company car, and he has the Lexus that's sort of like the family car, the leased Lexus. Now, the Lexus was the wife's, basically her car to show off and do business stuff with. So he kills his wife, kills his kids, loads them up into the truck. He leaves his wife's purse and her cell phone at the house. The bed upstairs, where he would later say the last time he saw his wife, she was lying in bed asleep or something, doesn't have its comforter on it. The blankets are gone, etc. And again, her car is still there. So in trying to get away with this crime, it is so ridiculously dumb. And again, Nicole, the friend, is an absolute superhero for sort of being the circuit breaker to anything he could have done to try to cover up his involvement at that point. Even though, unbeknownst to him, he had been filmed being the last person to go to and from the house after the wife arrived home from her business trip or her family trip. I forget which one it was. So he was screwed, even though he had no, that's the really funny part. He had no idea he was screwed until he was standing there in the neighbor's living room with the cop filming him, watching the security footage, showing him being the last person to go. Because the neighbor, he pulls up like, here's all the clips from the last 24 hours. Here's where the wife arrived home at 2 a.m. The next time there's any movement is when Chris Watts is moving his truck. And the next time there's any movement after that until this morning is Chris Watts leaving. So no one else came to and from the house the entire time. She never left. Like if he had gotten in her car and drove away at some point, maybe he could have covered it up, but he would have had to arrive home first, get in the truck, or drop the truck off, get in the car, drive the car off somewhere, and dump it. Then how does he get home without being spotted or leaving a record behind of an Uber or a taxi or something? There was no planning to this whatsoever. And so, sorry, I forget who it was in the chat, but somebody says, he's just going to come back home. He's going to clean everything up. And then, 2 or 3 days later, maybe somebody will notice she's missing, or he'll call in a missing persons report kind of thing. And then he'll just go on with his life. Oh, well, she just left me. I told her I wanted a divorce, and she decided to pack up and take the kids. I don't know what happened to her after that. Oh, well, I'm going to go fuck my mistress now. I mean, I don't know. It just the absolute idiocy of whatever he thought he was going to do, or however he thought the story was going to go from there, right? Because as suspicious as the mistress is, even she brings up the fact of, what did he expect to have happen? That his wife disappears and then suddenly we're going to be together and nothing would ever be questioned about that? She's not wrong. So, yeah, I'm going to go back to the chat real quick. Celtic Mandalore says, could show he have thought I'm getting pissed. Maybe I missed something that was said before. I'm getting in the middle of things. Sorry, guys. Tyler Lalonde says, when did this happen? This was back August. The murders occurred between the days of August 12th and 13th of this year. He was arrested on the 15th after 2 days of investigation, after he'd been interviewed by the local news on the 15th. Like early on the morning of the 15th or something, he was interviewed by the news while cadaver dogs were wandering around his house trying to find evidence. And you can tell that it happened on the same day because the shirt he's wearing when he's interviewed by the news guys is the same shirt he's wearing when he's interrogated by the cops in the video they've released. So it all happened very quickly. He was caught very, very quickly, thanks in part to Nicole, the neighbor, or best friend of Shannon, and the next door neighbor's video camera footage that showed that there was no one else to come and go from the house. So she wasn't kidnapped by anybody. She didn't leave of her own accord. The only person seen coming and going was Chris Watts in his truck in the time that she would have, quote unquote, disappeared. So he was screwed from the get-go. Captain Assassin says, how goes it? Goes fine today. I got inspired to do this just for the heck of it because it's been something I've been watching bits and pieces of. Celtic Mandalore, I'm sorry for the fucking up of my words. Pissed off now because of this story. Typos abound. Okay. Yeah, this Chris Watts did the smart thing for everybody, and he confessed to killing them all, even though initially his story was he caught her killing their children after he told her he wanted a divorce, and then he killed her in a fit of rage, which logically means that he didn't then call the police or something. No, he dumps the bodies, tries to hide it, lies to everybody, and seemingly prepares to go running away with his mistress or something. Yeah, no, he's a fucking piece of shit liar, an absolute monster, just of the nth degree. I mean, if he had been some kind of career criminal, if he'd been some kind of known dirt scumbag prior to this, it wouldn't have reduced the enormity of the crimes he committed, but it would be, I guess, a bit less shocking in a way, at least as far as his behavior. But there was nothing. This was just your sort of milquetoast, run-of-the-mill suburban dad, so far as anybody knew. To do something like this, the combination of things, the magnitude of it, this guy is going to rot in a concrete box forever. I think he's too much of a coward to kill himself. So he's going to be, he's going to be rotting away, and he's also going to have a bullseye on his back forever. Because you want to talk about the lowest rung in the criminal underworld in a prison. It's anybody who harms children, pedophiles, child killers, people like that. Yeah, but this guy in particular, given his notoriety, and given that he killed his own children, his own two little innocent girls who did nothing. There's video out there of him playing with his kids. These two sweet, playful little girls. Yeah, so I'm not for the death penalty. I've said this on the show before. I think any punishment that is irreversible claims to be a part of an infallible system. And we know that our justice system is not infallible. Therefore, having the death penalty, even after an appeals process, to me, is a dangerous element to have in our justice system. But now that he's confessed, now that he's in prison, I'm not going to cry if something happens to him. I just don't think the state should be the one to do such a thing. But since there's absolutely no evidence that anyone else did anything about this but him, that he's the killer, etc., I'm not going to weep if he ends up injured, maimed, or otherwise in prison, or alternately, if he ends up spending the rest of his life in administrative segregation, cut off from the rest of the world, everybody else, and it just goes even more nuts by himself in his cell. You know what I heard? And again, this is rumor mill stuff, so I might be wrong. I heard that his first biggest hurdle in adjusting to prison life was being weaned off of his cell phone addiction. Because even like from the footage you see on the body cams from the cops, the footage you see in the interrogation, he is attached to that phone like it's part of his being. It's nuts. It's just nuts. Let's see. Gayest person on YouTube says, all of these search results starting with Chris Watts gets. I'm here looking for the one that ends with him gets a Moab tested on. Yeah. Let's see. Sarjim says, in a case like this, when there's no doubt he did it, I'm 100% favor of the death penalty. Like I say, fundamentally, I'm not against him. I'm not against his life being short. Personally, I would rather he have to suffer in isolation and loneliness and fear for the next 60, 70 years than have a quick out of just going off into that good night. Because honestly, I see death as a punishment, not so much as a punishment, but a release from responsibility. And I understand there's a different perspective from victims' families and things like that. And who knows, maybe I'd change my mind if I ended up, God forbid, becoming the family of a victim or something, but all the same. Let's see, what else? Yeah, everybody in the chat's like, he should just die. Yeah, like I say, I'm not going to shed a tear if something horrible happens to him. But honestly, given his personality and everything else, I would rather the horrific irony of him trying to escape his life through murder results in him having nothing but a life of isolation and captivity for the rest of it. Um, the other part that's really interesting, and I talked about this before, if you find the clip where he's watching the neighbor's security camera footage with the neighbor and the police, he is such a bad. I mean, he makes for a bad criminal, which is good because he was caught easy. You watch his body language, you watch his demeanor, you watch his eyes, you listen to what he says, and the really funny part, in a morbid way, is after Chris Watts has left the neighbor's house and the cop is staying behind with the neighbor's looking at the cop going like, that guy's suspicious as hell. Did you see him moving back and forth? You see him repeating all this stuff over and over to you, and he was the last one to go. I mean, hell, the the neighbor practically cracked the case right there, and it's very entertaining in retrospect. But yeah, I don't know if I have anything else more to say about it. I really recommend that if you are at all interested in things like this or want to see stuff about the case, all of the interrogations, and they are hours long, and there's lots of spaces in between where nothing happens because cops are coming and going and things. There's a couple of YouTube channels that do a good job of editing these things down to sort of digestible pieces. Crime Vault has a lot of good police interrogations. Some classic ones like Russell Williams and Stephanie Lazarus. If you know about those cases, if you don't know about those cases, look up Russell Williams' interrogation. Look up Stephanie Lazarus's interrogation. Those are I mean, by themselves, without any other commentary, play out like scripted events, especially the Russell Williams one. You want to see a dramatic progression in in an interrogation. Watch the Russell Williams interrogation. It's something just full without any other commentary. Don't look at a show or something. Just watch it. It's amazing. But yeah, you can see the body camera footage of the cops arriving at the house, talking to Chris Watts. You can see the news footage of them interviewing him. There's a couple of them out there. Just look at how deadpan he is, how unconcerned he comes across. He's not panicked. He's not curious. He just kind of talks like he's just, having a conversation. He's so subdued about his wife and small children missing. I don't know how he ever imagined he'd get away with it at all. But again, I'm so thankful for dumb criminals. Let's see. Before I go, I'll check in on a couple things. Angela Arriaga says, my stepfather was murdered by a man who also murdered his own stepfather. I don't wish him the death penalty, but my mother does. I get why, but yeah, I want him hurting. Death is easy. Jeez, Angela, I'm sorry to hear that. I had no idea. That's horrific. Yeah, I don't begrudge anybody who's been on the family of a victim of such a thing from having murderous thoughts or murderous desires. I really don't. As a emotional mental experiment, if I thought of like my sister or my parents or anybody else that I know having been murdered, I probably would want some kind of vengeance. But at least for the time being, in the distanced, stoic position, I guess I take on the matter, it's an element of our justice system that, like I say, if it is an irreversible punishment, it assumes an infallible system. And that's the principle I am presently operating on. Obviously, maybe that opinion will change if it hits me personally, but I'd like to think that, as they say, I would rather a guilty man go free, so to speak, than an innocent man be executed or punished, kind of thing. That's, it's just one of those things, the greater good, etc. Anyway, guys, I think that's all I wanted to say. I'll give another couple minutes if there's anything you wanted to ask me or any other thoughts you guys had on the case, if you know about it. Like I say, I recommend anybody who's interested in police stuff or interrogations or true crime, find some clips of this stuff. It's really interesting, especially the part where he's in the kitchen with Nicole as they go over finding her purse and everything, especially the part where he's with the neighbor and the cop watching the security footage. The news interview, there's a couple of great documentaries you can find on YouTube. Just look up Crocodile Tears. There's 2 or 3 different sort of documentary films about cases where the killer was interviewed by the cops and went to the public sort of seeking help when in fact they were the ones that committed the crime. Those are always fascinating to me as well, as sort of in combination with this. The Chris Watts um, lie detector test and the lead up to it. The most interesting thing about that is the way the female detective, I'm sorry, I don't know her name, conducts herself and interacts with him, sort of easing through and getting him to say things on the recording, getting him on the record about things he's got to say, his demeanor, his complete lack of panic or concern or emotion over the entire thing. And then the mistress's interviews are, I mean, they're interesting to observe how she's handling the situation and what her demeanor is. Her voice gets kind of annoying pretty quick, but and also just her complete lack of seeming compassion over the situation sort of grinded on my nerves a bit, all things considered. And her role in sort of not having a problem being the other woman, not having a problem helping a guy cheat on his wife, and yet being disgusted that he would like try to leave her kind of thing, but not be so disgusted as to want to help the cops by preserving information. I don't know. Not quite sure what her big deal is. I'm waiting to see if she decides to cash in on this with some kind of tell-all true book or ghost-written book or something. Okay, now that I've given that a couple minutes, scrolling up a bit. Let's see, counterculture-wise radio. Exactly, we trade our humanity for momentary relief. That is an easy way out for someone who doesn't deserve mercy. Some people do. Thankfully, a much lower percentage of people than everybody else in the world. But when it does happen, yeah, some people think that's going to be their escape when all they're doing is just destroying. I mean, how many, besides the lives he actually took, how many collateral lives has he just destroyed by this? His wife's family, his own family, all sets of grandparents, all her friends, all his friends. It's nuts. Lady Zaga says, think about the noise in prison. It's always noisy. However, the noise he will hear the most is the other inmates crying out his name at all times. Like I say, I do not begrudge any psychological or physical danger that he is in from this point onward. I really don't. I don't have any sympathy for him. The justice system and the mechanisms thereof aside, his personal individual case, yeah, he can just disappear for all I care. Let's see. Sergeant says, Scribe, you would change your opinion if you saw a murdered child in person. Jim, you're probably not wrong. But it would be on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't want to say, I'd like to think that the principle would override my emotion, because that's the whole idea of justice is blind. That's why we have due process, is to take the emotion out of it and focus on not only what is best for society, but how a case proceeds. This is why we criminalize vigilantism. This is why we have a process of having sort of a dispassionate procedure of justice rather than one of reflex and emotion. Again, I'm not going to say I would never have such impulses or such thoughts, but on principle, I don't think I'm going to move, even with something as horrific as a dead child or a dead family member. And I know maybe I think I'm telling stories out of school. And if, like I say, God forbid I'm put into such a situation. And if the time comes that I change my mind, I will eat humble pie for the rest of my life. But that's where I'm at. Let's see. Who else? Let's see. That's what Jim said. Let's see. Chantia Mola. She even called Shannon the other woman. Yeah, that was the other part. There's a couple of weird things the mistress said over the course of her interview. Sort of really, if not dehumanizing his wife, then certainly diminishing her, sort of individuality or her significance as her in relation to Chris. There's a lot of weird things about the mistress. I don't know if anything will ever come of it. I don't know if she actually did anything criminal or if she's just, like I say, a calloused individual, but whatever. Let's see. What else? Pronounced like Chantilla. Okay. I apologize. I read words sometimes well, sometimes not, if you watch Lords of the Night. Let's see. Well, anyway, guys, I'll wrap this up in a couple minutes. This was just sort of a one-off thing. This is a subject, murders and serial killers and things that I've always had an interest in. I've read so many true crime books. And obviously society at large, at least Western society, has a fascination with these things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many TV shows based around murder like CSI and mysteries like Unsolved Mysteries or Person of Interest, etc. All these mystery shows, or Agatha Christie novels, for crying out loud. So I don't know if I'm going to do anything like this again. If you guys like this kind of thing, if you find it interesting, let me know, because as these kind of things come up, or as like historical cases that I'm interested in come to mind, I might do this again or bring on other people to talk about such things. This isn't a change of format of the channel. Like I say, it might just be a one-off or it might be an occasional thing. But do let me know. I appreciate your feedback. Anything else? Nope, I think that's going to be it, guys. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me on this little ramble tirade. Again, if you're interested in this at all, there's plenty of people who've posted the footage of this. And I'm really hoping that at some point somebody does a supercut of all the relevant pieces of footage in chronological order showing sort of the evolution of the case as it was discovered all the way through to his arrest. That'll be really fun. I would do it, but that's a huge undertaking. We're talking about hours and hours and hours of different footage that's been released. So I'll just be lazy and hope somebody else does the labor for me. Anyway, guys, thank you again. And I will talk to you later. I'll see you on Lords of the Night tonight at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern over on Monkey's channel. And everybody, have a good weekend and take care.